which is different than what most people would think about when they think about energy, right? When we talk about energy in the New Age or in the, quantum physics or something like that. There's also terms. There's times when you could use energy more like what quantum physicists mean, and it would be closer to the idea of chi than others. So again, when we're talking about like the macrocosm, right? Chi in the macrocosm is probably pretty close to what quantum physicists mean when they say energy, I think. But when you apply it to a specific context, like feng shui, for example, where the qi in feng shui, to my understanding, I'm not a feng shui person, but the way that I understand it's used is basically how the mind fills up a space. Like that's the main component of that. So when I enter into this room, when my mind fills up this space, what does it do? And also, if my mind is of a certain quality and I design a space, how do I design that space naturally? And then if I change something about the space, how does my mind change? That's the science of feng shui. So that's when you talk about the qi of feng shui, you're talking about something that's a little bit different than what you mean when you talk about qi in the macrocosm, where you're kind of talking about this movement, this idea of movement behind what is visible that creates the visible through patterns of movement.
So I think that's where it's gotten stuck in, maybe not stuck, but either in physics or in health. It's like what we can see versus what we're experiencing, or maybe not versus what we're experiencing, but if you go like, is it a particle or is it a wave kind of a thing?
Right.
So like but I think for my interest, it's more about in health. Mm-hmm. So let's see if we can like focus the conversation to aspects of health and being well. Right. So if you were to say, as we're talking about energy in the body, or chi in the body, and I know that would be different for different contexts as well, because you already talked about these two different things. But say, as when you're a Chinese medicine practitioner, what are you attending to in terms of chi, or what is that form of chi?
So there's a couple of ways that you can explain that. Basically, the chi, I think the easiest way to explain it is that there's cycles of information that take place in the body, and that when you're interacting with the chi, you're changing the information that takes place, the communication of that information in the body from one spot to another. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is like, so one of the problems with the translation of chi into energy is to give us this idea that chi is more like electricity than it is water. And in the ancient time, the system of the channels, the Jing that was created, was more based on the idea of water than the idea of electricity.
So I absolutely, like, as you're saying that, even as you talk about like the meridians, like in my rudimentary Western mind, like it's just those are like channels, like electrical channels, almost like wires that I can't see, but they're going through the body this way, and so the acupuncture points are on these like electrical places, and yet at the same time, I know that like in intervening energetically, my intention when I'm intervening makes a lot of difference about how successful it is. So, but I know those two ideas don't necessarily match.
Right.
So that's where. So going back to, it's more like water than like electricity.
Kind of like a fluid. If you think of the mind being like a fluid running through the body, and the mind not being the brain, but being the experience of more like the Buddhist concept of mind, like everything is mind, sort of. Like the mind, like the way that the mind interacts with the body.
So
the relationship between the mind and the body is another way to define.
So if somebody said consciousness, what would you say? No, that's not. Yes, it is.
Consciousness is more like the idea of Shen. That's more like Shen as opposed to Qi. The Qi is more like there. It gets like confusing. Because some people will say that Shen is Qi at a certain stage.
So if there's somebody watching this, they might say, okay, now you're talking about Shen. I thought you were talking about Qi.
Right.
So it maybe just for people who explain those aspects.
So the one way to talk about this is to use the three treasures. We call the three treasures in Chinese the Jing, Qi, Shen. And it's Jing is Jing is like the most substantial. It's the closest to physicality, we would say, in the English language. There isn't a word that the ancient Chinese used that means physical, and there's reasons for that. The cosmology isn't interested in making anything physical, basically. But that's another.
It's a whole other.
That's topic. A whole other topic. Yeah. But basically, things that appear to us. One way that we can define Jing in the macrocosm, if we're just saying, what is Jing? Jing is the appearance of something. It's Qi that moves in a pattern. So Qi is something you can't see, right? Qi is something you can't see, and it moves into it. There's chaos. Qi is moving all over the place all the time. But when it starts to move into patterns, it has this tendency to appear. So then when it appears, it's Jing. So it's not two things. It's the same thing. It's like the overall, it's the same thing. But we're identifying different aspects of the same thing.
Is the Jing what it's disturbing? How the Qi is moving it? Or is the Jing actually the Qi itself when it's appearing?
More like the second one.
Okay.
The Jing is the Qi when it has a tendency to appear.
Okay.
And when the Jing doesn't appear, it's becoming more like Qi.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then when there is a kind of like a clear transition between Jing and Qi, when that process is harmonious, there's like a third thing that happens. And there's this kind of like luminous or shining quality to that experience, and that's evidence of the Shen. That's evidence of the greater thing. There's also this idea in Taoism of Yuan Shen. Yuan
means, so you didn't specifically define the Shen.
Right.
So do that for people.
Shen is difficult to define. That's one of the reasons. So some people, in some contexts, like in medicine, this is why these terms are confusing, because when you apply them to a context, it means something different. So when you say consciousness, the easiest way to translate that into Chinese thought is Shen. But when Shen is used in a specific context, it means something like that, but in the context. So if I say that a person has a Shen disturbance in Chinese medicine, meaning they have a hard time falling asleep because their mind is racing, the Shen that we're referring to is more like the mind than it is like the consciousness.
I see.
So it gets applied to that specific instance. Just like the Qi of the macrocosm, we define the Qi of the macrocosm as like, we can use feng shui again, like feng being wind, shui being water. So feng, wind, is like Qi. It moves everything, but you can't see it. But you would be an idiot to deny that it's real. It's there. There's something there that's moving everything. But we can't see. We can't tell what it is. That's Qi. But then there's also shui, water, right? And water is tangible. You can feel it. You can see it. But you can't rely upon it because it changes so quickly. Right, water is always changing its state and stuff like that. So
that's why Qi is more like water, because Qi is always changing.
Qi is more like wind in that context.
Okay, yeah. All right.
Because wind is always changing too. The reason that you use the reason that metaphor is useful is because you can't see wind.
Okay, I see.
And you can't see Qi.
I get it. Okay.
So you were asking a question about Shen, right?
Well, I wanted to get back, so you were talking about the three treasures.
The three treasures.
Yeah.
And
for me, like one of the concepts that you've talked about, the Shen in people's eyes. So as a mental health person, right. Like that has a lot of meaning for me.
Yeah.
So like when people come in, now that I have that term like in my head, I'll say, "Oh, good Shen today, great."
Right.
And before I might have said good energy. Oh, you've got good energy today. Like just when I see people come in, or like you'll see, I've seen times when I've like looked at you and said, "Oh, what's wrong? Your Shen is off."
Right. Yeah.
Like, oh.
Yeah. See, you understand. So that again, this is the concept. So you take the macrocosm, the idea of Shen, and you apply it to medicine or like a person, right? So the macrocosm idea of Shen is if you look at the character, it's like light that comes from the stars. Like that's what it is. That's what it's a reference to. So it's very Tolkien-esque in a way. Like Tolkien knows about Shen. If you read the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit or any of that stuff, he knows about Shen because he will describe particularly the elves like he had a light and was in his eyes like a pale star or like a cold evening star or something like that, and that is the Shen. So so if you take that idea of the macrocosm and apply it to a person in medicine, one of the things that we look for is a luminous quality that comes off of a human being. And it's like the way that it's described in the textbooks is like, oh, there's a sheen to the skin, and like you look into the person's eyes and there's kind of a brightness there.
But it's also, this is why this is so hard to talk about, which is why I wanted to do this. Because like if I had a word, I would probably call it vitality.
Vitality, yeah.
Well, what is vitality?
Right.
And how do you see vitality?
Right.
But it's also an experiential thing.
It is.
Between me, like, noticing it in you, or you noticing it in me. Like, it would... That's why this is hard, because I think in Western terms, or even in language, or our language, we try to, like, break things down.
Right, yeah.
And most of these concepts are moving concepts or relational concepts.
Right, yeah.
So...
That's the way that the Chinese language is. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to understand. It's not intentionally like that, though. Like
they're not just doing it to piss us off.
They're not doing it to piss us off, or they're not doing it to be mysterious.